You've probably shopped at 7-Eleven before, but have you ever wondered how much money that store actually makes and how much the owner takes home? The answer might blow your mind. Here's the short version. A typical 7-Eleven does somewhere between $1 and $2 million a year in sales, but the owner, after paying 7-Eleven for its share of the profit, plus staff, inventory, and rent, usually walks away with somewhere between $50,000 and $150,000 a year. That's a real livable income, but it's nowhere near what you'd expect from a store doing over $1 million in sales. And once you understand why the gap is that big, you'll understand something most people never think about. Owning a famous brand and getting rich are two completely different things. But to really get this, we need to go back to where 7-Eleven actually started, because the story is way weirder than you'd expect. 7-Eleven didn't start as a convenience store. It started in 1927 in Dallas, Texas, as an ice house. A guy named Joe Thompson sold blocks of ice to families who needed to keep food cold. This was before most people had refrigerators. Then, Thompson noticed something. Customers kept asking if he could sell them milk, bread, and eggs too, so they didn't have to make a separate trip to the store. So he did. And just like that, the convenience store was basically invented by accident. For a while, the stores were called totem stores because customers toted away their purchases. Some locations even had actual totem poles out front. Then, in 1946, the company changed the name to something simpler, 7-Eleven, because that's when the stores were open, 7 a.m. to 11 p.m., 7 days a week. At the time, that was wild. Most stores closed early and were shut on Sundays. 7-Eleven kept innovating from there. They introduced the Slurpee in 1966, the Big Gulp in 1976. They were one of the first stores to offer to-go coffee and one of the first to stay open 24 hours. By the late 1960s, there were already 3,500 stores across the U.S. So far, this is a pretty normal American success story. But then, something happened that most people have no idea about. In the 1980s, the company that owned 7-Eleven, Southland Corporation, took on a massive amount of debt trying to fend off a hostile takeover. By 1990, they owed $1.8 billion they couldn't pay. Southland filed for bankruptcy. To survive, Southland sold 70% of the company to a Japanese partner, a company called Ito Yokado, for a $430 million cash injection. That Japanese partner already ran 7-Eleven stores in Japan under a licensing deal from years earlier. Here's the twist. Those Japanese-run 7-Eleven stores had become wildly successful, more successful in some ways than the original American stores. So when the American company collapsed, the Japanese branch essentially bought its own parent. By 2005, 7-Eleven became a fully owned subsidiary of a new company, 7&I Holdings, based in Tokyo. So this classic American brand, with the ice house origin story, the totem poles, the Big Gulp, has been majority owned by a Japanese company for over 30 years now. Most Americans walking into a 7-Eleven today have absolutely no idea they're shopping at a Japanese-owned company. And it gets even more interesting when you look at how differently the business performs in each country. Today, 7-Eleven operates more than 85,000 stores across roughly 19 to 20 countries. To put that in perspective, that's more locations than McDonald's and Starbucks combined. But here's what surprises people. Most of those stores aren't in America. Japan actually has more 7-Elevens than the US does. Thailand is the second biggest market, with over 13,800 stores. In the US, there are only around 9,000 to 13,000 locations, depending on how you count licensed and franchised stores. So the brand that started as a Texas ice house is now, at its core, more of a Japanese and Southeast Asian retail giant that happens to still exist in America, not the other way around. So let's get back to the actual money, because this is where it gets interesting. If you wanted to become a 7-Eleven franchise owner in the US today, your total investment could range anywhere from around $140,000 on the low end to over $1.6 million on the high end. The franchise fee alone can be anywhere from $0 to over $1 million. 7-Eleven actually sets that fee individually for each store based on that specific location's sales history. Here's the part most people don't know. 7-Eleven doesn't take a cut of your total sales like most franchises do. Instead, it takes a share of your store's gross profit, commonly described as somewhere around half, though the exact split varies by store and by market. That's a very different and honestly tougher deal than a lot of other franchises offer. So even if your store does $1.5 million in sales, you're not keeping anywhere near that. After 7-Eleven takes its cut of the profit, and after you pay for labor, inventory, rent, and everything else, you're typically left with that $50,000 to $150,000 range we mentioned earlier. And here's a genuinely wild fact. It's been reported that the average U.S. 7-Eleven store operates on a profit margin of around 3.5%. In Japan, that number is closer to 27%. Same brand, same name, same Slurpee machine, completely different business reality, depending on which country you're standing in. And if you want proof that 7-Eleven is a genuinely massive piece of the global economy, not just your neighborhood gas station, consider this. In 2024, Circle K's parent company, a Canadian giant called Alimentation Couche-Tard, tried to buy 7-Eleven's parent company outright. Their offer eventually reached $47 billion. It would have been the largest foreign takeover of a Japanese company in history. 7&I Holdings fought it off for almost a year. In July of 2025, Couche-Tard finally gave up and withdrew the bid, accusing 7&I of stalling. 7&I called that unfair. Either way, the deal collapsed, and 7-Eleven stayed Japanese-owned. Analysts said the real reason the deal failed wasn't really about money. It was about the fact that in Japan, 7-Eleven isn't just a convenience store. It's considered close to national infrastructure. During earthquakes and disasters, these stores are often the first to reopen. That's not something a foreign company was ever going to be allowed to just buy. So here's the real answer to the question we started with. A 7-Eleven owner in the U.S. typically makes a solid but pretty ordinary middle-class income, somewhere around $50,000 to $150,000 a year, despite running a store that does over $1 million in sales. Owning a piece of one of the biggest brands on earth doesn't automatically mean you're rich. Sometimes it just means you're running a demanding, 24/7 small business that happens to share a name with a global Japanese retail giant most of its customers have never heard of. Did any of this surprise you? The Japan ownership, the real income number, or the failed $47 billion buyout? Let me know which part in the comments. And if you want more real breakdowns like this, subscribe, because we're just getting started.